Hi guys, welcome back. Today in our lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about social movements. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? First of all, as always, we're going to define our big concept here. So what is a social movement? And then we're going to think about a couple of different aspects of social movements. So we're going to think about what motivates them. So what is that spark that creates a social movement? We're going to think about what types of social movements exist and how we can differentiate them. Okay. And then we're going to wrap up by thinking about the role of the media in social movements and thinking about something that we call the power elite that we'll define a little bit later on. So to start, obviously, we're going to start by defining what is a social movement, why are they important, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so very generally, when we talk about a social movement, we're thinking about some sort of broad alliance between people. Okay, so an alliance being some sort of bond, some connection between people. And this connection is built on a sense of shared interest in social change. Okay, so that a group of people are all motivated by some sort of desired social change, and so that brings them together into a social movement. That sounds pretty vague and broad. It's because it is, and the reason for that is because there's a lot of different types of social movements that we're going to talk more about in the second part of this lecture. Important to note is that social movements don't necessarily just have to advocate for a type of change. They can also be in opposition to some sort of change, right? So if we think about political social movements, for example, that are in opposition to policy changes or political administrations, that's a good example of how a social movement can also be based in opposition rather than advocating for something, an additional something. They're oriented towards group action. So a social movement is not just one person desiring some sort of change, it's a group of people. And so we have that collective element of a social movement, which is necessary and inherent, and also action, right? That social movement is not just thinking about hypothetical change or dreaming of some sort of change, but actually there's an action component to it that in order for it to be a social movement, there needs to be some sort of collective action, as I've been saying. Some sort of collective action towards achieving that goal or that progress or that opposition. And moreover, formal organizations are necessary. Social movements can be really informal, right? So they can be based online, for example. They can just be based on a loose collective of people. They don't need to be formally organized in any way. However, many social movements are formally organized. Okay, and again, we're using that term formal organization to refer to things that are objective and rationally oriented, right? So oriented towards some shared goal. So often we see what we call social movement organizations, which is just a formal organization that represents the social movement and tries to advance its cause in some way. So, for example, we could think of PETA as a great example of a type of organization that's for some sort of social movement cause. In this case, it would be against animal cruelty, pro-veganism, et cetera, et cetera. Additionally, we could think of something like the NAACP, which advocates for equality and racial rights as a representation of a type of social movement. So when we think about modern social movements, there's generally four different categories that they fall into that we see nowadays. It's very common. So the sociologist Anthony Giddens, who works in political sociology, identifies four different types of movements that characterize modern society. So the first is democratic movements that work for political change. These are really common. We see these all the time, right? Organizations or groups of people that are politically oriented and take political action. The second is labor movements that work for control of the workplace, right? So we could think of union strikes, et cetera, just sort of social movements that advocate for equality within the workplace. Third is ecological movements that are concerned with the environment specifically. Again, we could think about PETA as a good representation of that as well, okay, or the March against climate change is a really good example of this. And then finally, we have peace movements. So social movements oriented towards world peace or ending genocides, things like that. Again, that should sound familiar to you in some way. Social movements also have this really interesting capacity to spawn counter movements. So when a social movement emerges, often what happens is that different movements branch off of it, right? So for example, we could think about feminism in the 1960s, right? So suddenly groups of women were coming together to advocate once again for women's rights and gender equality. And what we saw was that this spawned additional social movements in opposition to expanding women's legal rights. And this included men, but this also included a lot of women who were interested in traditional gender values. Okay, so often when we see a social movement emerge, there's also sort of a reaction in which other movements emerge in opposition to counter it. Finally, for this portion of the lecture, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the sociology of social movements and how we have tended to think about social movements in the past and how we do that today. So social movements emerged as a subfield in sociology post-World War II. And this is true for lots of different social science fields. That World War II really spawned a new field of questions that people were interested in for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is that we saw some really kind of disturbing collective behavior during World War II, right? So we saw in Germany just these ordinary people just sort of adopt Nazism, right? Support the Nazi party, and in many cases turn a blind eye to the horrors going on in Germany, right? And that really struck a fear in a lot of people, right? So how could these average, normal people suddenly commit these heinous crimes or support people who do commit these heinous actions, right? So lots of sociologists then became interested in this form of collective behavior and what they called the psychology of the crowd, right? So how it is that a crowd of people, sort of their general psyche changes, their attitudes, their values seem to shift overnight. So sociologists started asking questions like, how do collectives come to widely uphold authoritarian ideas, right? Even if they weren't previously political. How is it that suddenly a big group of people is okay complying to these authoritarian regimes? And that's a complicated question, and lots of people have answered it now, and there's a lot of different ways to address it. But sort of immediately after World War II, the biggest way to think about this was thinking about authoritarian ideas as a kind of contagion, right? So that metaphor is very specific and it comes up a lot. So when we think about a contagion or like a virus, and I know this is a little like dew on the nose right now, but if we think about how a contagion spreads, right, in a crowd, one person might have an idea and they spread it to another person who spreads it to another person, and suddenly you have a crowd of people who all believe in the same idea, right? And so the sociologists were arguing that authoritarian ideas are really dangerous because they spread through crowds like this, and suddenly you have a crowd of people whose psyche has been poisoned, per se, by these dangerous ideas, and suddenly you have a social movement that's really hard to combat, right? So in the past, in the 50s, post-World War II, that was largely how social movements were talked about, right, as a kind of contagion, thinking about how do negative ideas spread, and focusing on the psychology of the crowd, right? How do you suddenly have a mob on your hands or a group of people who are Nazis, right? Things like that. That's really different than how we think about social movements today. So today we focus more on how social movements are productive rather than destructive, okay? And that goes for social movements that maybe we don't even support, okay, you wouldn't support. We focus on how are social movements rationally oriented, right? So oriented towards some sort of goal. And what do they do to achieve that goal, right? So no longer are we focusing on the contagion of ideas or the psychology of the crowd. but we're focusing more on how do social movements act in ways to achieve productive goals for them. Okay, so we would also ask questions like, how do social movements rationally use resources to their own ends? Sort of what steps are they taking to achieve their goals? How do they form? And then what do they do from there? So rather than focusing on a social movement as something destructive and dangerous to the everyday person, we now think about social movements as something that's productive in some way and also rationally oriented towards some goal. So it's not that the everyday person is suddenly going to be overcome with these dangerous authoritarian ideas that they're going to have to succumb to because they're so powerful. Instead, we think of social movements as rational, right? They have some goal, and then they're going to do these steps to achieve that goal. So they're a little bit more benign when we think about them like that, right? And more productive for us to think about that rather than to fear the crowd and all that the crowd could potentially do. Okay, so that's going to wrap up part one of this lecture. In part two, we're going to think a little bit more about types of social movements and how we can categorize them.